With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, let's talk some economics with our buddy, Stephen Popick. We haven't had him on for a long time. He tweets under motto economist. He is not at a 3-letter federal institution. He's at a 4-letter federal institution, but we will not hold that against him for the purposes of this conversation. That's also Dr. Stephen to him, although he doesn't use that much. He knows economics, my friend. So explain it to me like I'm 5, buddy.
Well, I've been away for a little while, for about a month or two. I was not in the country, so happy to talk econ today. I guess we're hot off the presses with yet another jobs report. Seems like every month we all freak out about a jobs report.
Let me tell you about my vacation. I went on vacation the day before Trump got shot, and I was having my daughter's wedding about 2 hours after Biden stepped aside and announced that on that Sunday. So that was my vacation. So I picked a heck of a 2 weeks to take off.
You know what I would like for both of us in 2025?
Peace, quiet, and boredom.
Very boring year.
A very boring. I'm with you, buddy. Let's do some boredom. Let's start with that jobs report, because here's the thing. We do jobs reports. The official ones are quarterly. The ones that really matter are yearly.
Mm-hmm.
Give us lay folks something to pick through, because on the surface, this job reports ain't good. It's not horrific, but it's not good. The joke is unexpectedly, because everything's unexpected, which means you didn't prepare to start with. Walk the lay people through how to handle a breaking news thing like jobs report is not good. Jobs report is good because it's all context. It's all numbers. None of us outside of you folks that do this all the time really know what this stuff really means, other than how the news frames it. Give us a way to get into these sorts of things, and use this one as an example, if you want to, of how to actually understand it so that we get what we need without all the noise.
Yeah, well, let's back up a bit, and let's first explain, at least, or remember, what's been going on in the economy for the last 2 years, and what the Federal Reserve has been trying to do with their lack of changing in the interest rates. See, the Federal Reserve has been trying to contain and slow down inflation, which I think was 5, 6, 7, 8% at the height of the pandemic across the U.S. And recently, we've got inflation numbers now that just came out a week or two ago that said that currently we're looking at about 2.5% year-over-year inflation. This is leading a lot of economists and policymakers to think that we're getting close to taming the inflation dinosaur right now. Which is good news, right? The ever increasing prices, they're slowing down. They're going back to a normal rate of increase. We need a normal rate of increase in the economy. Deflation's not good for the long-term health of an economy. What we're not going to get back is the decline in purchasing power that we had during COVID, with that high inflation that we had. We're not going to get back to those days. Sorry, prices are not going to go back down 20%. But the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates very high despite a lot of pressure from Republicans and Democrats to sort of tame down this beast of inflation. They've been watching what is inflation doing and what is unemployment doing, and they're playing a dance, a tango between these two. And they're trying to look for inflation getting under control and the labor market starting to soften up. And when you have those two facts lining up, right, inflation being tamed, job market softening, that's when they had signaled that they'd start consider cutting rates, which are about 5.25% right now. And I think before the pandemic, we were very low, lower than I thought we could be. I think in the mid 3s. So they've been waiting for this kind of this is what the Fed's been waiting for, right? So when first people say this is a disappointing jobs report, I have to say I don't know what kind of economic reporter you are and where you've been living for the last 2 years. This is the jobs report the Fed's been waiting for. Because last week, Jerome Powell came out, right, and he said very clearly he is open to a September rate cut. See, the Fed's tracking some of this stuff too. They get information in real time, using their own surveys, often, before even the BLS result comes out. So they had a good sense that they were going to get, I think, a jobs report that was going to look like this, which, as I said, is meeting their two things that they're looking for: inflation being tamed and the job market softening. Well, yes, the job market here is softening, right? Unemployment did go up. We're still at historically low levels of unemployment. Remember, back before I guess the 2010s or whatnot, we as economists never thought that you could run an economy for a long time at a sub 4% unemployment rate. And yet through the 2010s, we ran an economy with quite often a sub 4% unemployment rate, and saw relatively low, we saw really low inflation. Not relatively, we saw really low inflation. So, that sort of surprised folks. So I think this is getting us back to sort of the norm for unemployment that we were expecting. I'm going to note also that, in this report, I also pay attention to what happened to the estimates from the prior months. The estimates of unemployed and jobless claims for the last 2 months did go up as well, but fairly marginal. One thing that stands out to me in the BLS report, these are surveys, Andrew. This is not a one-to-one accounting of the jobs market. You didn't get contacted if you have a job. I didn't get contacted if I had a job. There are errors. There are error bars associated with these measurements. And so it's hard for me, looking at this. You can't really say, is this a real change, right? Exactly how much did it tick up? We don't see that. They treat it as more definitive than it actually is. But what we're seeing here, right, is again, the biggest driver of these unemployment changes are actually people who are on a temporary layoff, because that went up by almost 1 million people in month over month. But the total number of people that had lost their job permanently hadn't really changed. Long-term unemployed hadn't really changed. So I think this was driven. Hasn't there been a sector, I believe, that's been in the news for a lot of layoffs and a lot of hour shortening right now? Something in IT, I guess. So I think that's what's driving it right now. So look, I generally am looking at this report and I'm saying this is exactly what the Fed wanted to see to cut a rate in September. I'm going to go out on a limb right now and boldly make a prediction. We're going to get a rate cut in September. That seems pretty locked in right now.
Now, September, of course, is important in the economic world because that's, technically the last month of the fiscal year. So what does that practically mean, though? Because we hear things like rate cut, interest rate, inflation, jobs number, unemployment number. The thing that's hurting folks is they just know when they go to the store, stuff's more expensive. They know
It
that.
is.
That's all they know. And I don't like the word vibe, but this is a vibe economics discussion because it just feels one way, and it doesn't matter what chart you got. You're not going to unconvince people that, well, things aren't good because gas is expensive and food's expensive. That's a relative term to their POV and whatever world they live in.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how about 90% of people in the world feel right now: is gas is too expensive, food's too expensive, everything's expensive, economy's not good. I understand on paper there's some foundations to the economy that's good. We could talk about national debt and that stuff later. What would an actual rate cut mean? Because if you're just doing, what are they going to do, a quarter point or something like that? Might do a half if he really gets a wild hair. Does that really mean anything to the average person? Because again, like you're saying, this is long-term planning stuff. They're landing a blimp here. This isn't a sports car where they're doing a U-turn, right? They got to adjust it now, adjust it. This is the vibe, and the actual steering of this stuff is two very different things. So what does that rate cut actually mean to people? Because they're not going to see that at the grocery store on October.
Well, look, as I said, we had the COVID economy where we saw rapid price increases, and wages did not keep up. So yes, people felt the pinch, and rightly they should. Like that is, I sometimes feel like my fellow economists that are out there in policy wonks don't say, I acknowledge the pain and your feelings that your dollar isn't going as far. It isn't. We know that. What economists are saying is yes, we know we've been through a lot of pain with painful price rises. The how prices are rising are getting back to a more normal level. So, that's a good sign, which is, yes, that's a good sign. It's not getting worse now, but we're not going to make up what we had happen during COVID. Um, Not for a while, anyways. Although, I got to be a two-handed economist here. This same report here tells us that the average wage gains, or median wage gains, sorry, went up by 3.6%. Inflation in that same period went up by 3%. So that's a 0.6% real increase in incomes, right? So that will help tame what happened with inflation over time, but it's going to take a long time for those small deltas between wage growth and inflation to add up. Now, what does this mean for the average for most folks? What the Fed's trying to do is, you can't control inflation if you're seeing a lot of wage growth. You just can't. They're sort of feeding off of each other. The more money that's out there chasing goods in the system, the more that folks are going to the businesses are going to be able to raise their prices. It's just simple money demand. So what I guess we can say here is, the Fed's going to cut rates, probably a quarter of a point, probably 25 basis points, simply because they're cautious. They don't want to overstep things. This is the first signal they're getting to actually cut. I wouldn't expect a 50 basis point. I'd be a little bit shocked personally at that. But I think it's there to say, what they're going to try to do is say, okay, now that this is controlling we're now going to be waiting more about making sure unemployment doesn't get too much higher, right? Because people being out of a job is a really bad thing. Having a little, you're going to have some inflation, but being out of a job is very, very bad, right? And so now that inflation's been appearing to be tamed, or close to being tamed, now's the time to focus a little bit more about making sure unemployment doesn't go crazy again. And so by lowering interest rates, the Fed's going to essentially lower the cost of borrowing. These interest rates affect like the intraday bank lending rates, which then filter out to the rest of the economy. So, hopefully by lowering the rates, they begin to incentivize business growth, job growth, stabilize that. So that, we don't have unemployment that starts to spike up just like inflation did 4 years ago. We don't want to be yo-yoing between periods of high inflation and high unemployment. That would not be ideal.
Yeah, Stephen Popick joining us, economist. I always say that. I don't know why I put an extra syllable in your name. I'm sorry. It's habit. I don't know why I do it.
I don't care, man. I don't
know. It's too much hillbilly and that Eastern European stuff. We just don't handle it really well.
We don't need to talk about any hillbilly elegy books. We would just rant about how awful of a book that was for a while.
No, I don't care what the kid that grew up an hour north of Cincinnati thinks about anything involving hills. I wonder one thing. We used to talk about it a lot more than we do now. The value of the dollar. Now that has a large economic, like what is it against the euro or the British pound sterling or the rupee, or pick whatever you want. The value of the dollar, when you get down to the basics, a lot of this, housing, your wages, how far that goes, inflations, it's really the value of the dollar for the individual citizen of the United States of America. That's really the basics of consumer economics, right? What's that dollar worth? How far it'll go? How do you manipulate that either higher or lower based on what you need to do? The value of the dollar.
Which is going to be different in San Francisco, California versus Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Correct. So how do we go back to the basic fundamentals? If I remember the first econ class I ever took, he started out holding up the dollar bill and says, we are going to talk about this. but we won't talk about this again till the end of the course because we got to go through all this. And he waves at the board with all the stuff on it so we can get back to what this means, which was an excellent answer and an excellent way to intro it. How do we set the value of the dollar in its proper place discussing economics? Because really that is the basic building block to the normal consumer, the normal person listening to this or watching this on YouTube. What is my dollar actually worth? How do we kind of reset that into the discourse?
I think, one, it's going to have to be a local conversation since costs of living vary quite a bit across the US. But we should talk about the value of the dollar in terms of people being able to do what they like to do. When folks report they can't take their kids on not an extravagant vacation, but just a short vacation, the value of the dollar probably isn't enough. When people report that they're not able to afford food and they're skipping a lunch, maybe the value of a dollar isn't enough, right? So I would say let's think about it in more practical terms. Like what does it get? Um, what does it get for a family? And recognize that's going to be different in a lot of places. And make sure that we're giving people, the policies we should be aiming for is giving people opportunities to have the jobs, to have the financial security, to be able to go for things that we once took for granted in America, right? And I don't mean extravagances. I was actually watching a YouTube video last night, and it was one of these. I hardly watch these things, but it was one of these crash interviewers, and he was talking to this woman who had a kid, and he was asking her how much do you make, and she said, well, she was a young woman with a kid. Her husband um, earns 30,000 a year, and he's like, isn't that what do you have to live? What would you say you have to live comfortably? And she says 30,000 a year. It's hard, but we make it work. Um, we're clothed, we're fed. It's not a lavish lifestyle, but we're comfortable and we're happy because we know what we value is each other and our kids. And the interviewer just wasn't getting it. That you could be happy on 30K, but it was an appreciation for her. She understood her cost of living. They clearly understood how to budget, um, and they understood how to make priorities and changes. And so, what we should be doing, I hope, is for folks across the U.S., we give them, the economic policies and opportunities that allow them to basically have those not lavish but comfortable lifestyles. I hope that makes sense.
No, it
I
makes
just have to
sense, and
listen to people.
it makes sense, and I did it to this because one economic thing that I do pay a whole lot of attention to, that doesn't get talked about by those talking heads a lot, are I watch the personal debt numbers a lot, and there has been it's in give me the big word for it. It's indisputable now as we've came out of COVID. I've been watching it over the last almost 2 years now out of COVID. It's undeniable. What has happened is to combat inflation, people have taken on personal debt to maintain lifestyle coming out of COVID as inflation came up. That's not arguable across the board. I know it's not every single person, but on the average, most Americans, that's what a lot of them have done. That's not an economic indicator that shows up until later, but that's a troubling sign that I pay attention to. Those little things you see now and then, like how many Americans have $500 of emergency savings if they needed it right now, go get it.
Hmm.
Personal debt loads, things like that. When you combine it with everything else, now we're talking about a real economic thing that's not getting talked about. But now all of a sudden you can explain that vibe part we started with that the talking heads sometimes don't fully understand, but the average folks fully understand it. And that kind of compensating for inflation with personal debt, we all know that's not real great economic policy, but in a short term, a lot of folks are doing it. And that's part of this whole story in the economics, isn't it?
It is. Um, and we keep in mind also, right? So it's not just personal debt, Andrew. I will have to correct you, unfortunately, on one thing here.
I'm wrong on a lot of things. Go for it.
It's the carrying cost of that personal debt, right? So if you could have someone who has $1,000 on their credit card but they're paying it off in $100 installments every month, and they're going to be paying a 0% interest rate. That's an entirely different story than someone with $1,000 on a credit card paying a 20% interest rate, right? One has a much lower carrying cost, right? And so we'd have to understand sort of what are the expenses of carrying that debt rather than just the debt itself. One of my comments, and you talked about it, I hear it a lot, the national debt. Yeah, well, the national debt goes up every day. It will always go up every day. That's just the national debt. Like the day that we see the national debt actually be negative and go down, I'll be like, really? I think it happened once for a couple of months back when was it Bill Clinton was president and the Republicans had Congress, and I don't know, something happened for a few months.
96, 97, one for
Yeah,
like 6 months. Yeah.
yeah, for 6 months, which is obviously an aberration. It's about what the carrying
On the
cost of that
best
debt is.
economy we've ever seen post World War II, by the way, but that's another part of it.
Yeah, and in that one, they just weren't able to raise government spending enough to spend all the extra money we were getting from a great economy.
And Europe had just
And
reunified, so Eastern Europe and
mhm.
Germany was down. There was a lot that went into that.
Yeah, well, maybe Great Britain can come back into the EU, and that'll juice the economy for a
Oh, see,
couple
now
years.
you're
So,
just stirring up trouble.
nah, obviously I'm not being serious about that. So no, but to go back, so I want to know, how that carrying cost is going to change over time. Like clearly now, you know, if consumers wind up, if interest rates decline, the carrying cost of debt will decline a bit more. Um, but if consumers are carrying debt that are in these high interest rate products and they're not paying off their credit lines, they're buying homes where, yes, they have a high interest rate, and yes, that payment is going to be hard for them to manage. Something like back in the days of the 05, 06, where we had all those ninja loans and those high cost balloon loans that thankfully don't exist too much anymore. But if we see debt that's being carried like that, that's a danger sign. That's a warning sign, as you said. But I don't look at the absolute level of debt itself to be as much of a red flag. It's certainly a warning indicator, but it's not a strong warning indicator. It's much like the inverted yield curve it's a warning indicator of a recession, but it's not perfectly predictive. Or the Sahm Rule, warning indicator for a recession, not necessarily perfectly predictive, right? So if we start seeing a lot of these red lights popping off, then I'm going to start getting concerned. If we only see one or two red lights popping off, I might just say, that's noise. You
All
know,
right. Sahm Rule, you just brought it up. As we're recording this, we got that job report out. The Sahm Rule is now trending on Twitter because that is the soundbite of the day. Everybody's a Sahm Rule expert. It's all over, all the big things. I'm sitting here watching it go viral. Sahm Rule recession. It's only been wrong once ever since 1950, blah, 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 blah. This is going to be the buzzword going into the weekend. Clearly, as Sahm Rule, we're all going to go to recession. Everybody panic. Obviously, this is politically driven by a lot of folks. Is this noise? Is this a head pat? Should we panic? Sort this out. Tell people what the Sahm Rule
I
is,
mean,
and is it triggering? And is this something that we should be worried about right this moment?
so the Sahm Rule it's named after Claudius Sahm, who was an economist at the Federal Reserve Board. What it does is basically tracks the unemployment rate sort of in a moving average, right? And asks if the moving average rises by a certain amount, then that triggers the Sahm Rule. In other words, it moves so much that, it moved from 3.6 to 4.3. That is more than about I think it's about a 0.5%, in the calendar year. So that's going to trigger a recession, right? That's what Claudia Sum's rule is. And look, she's the author of it, and I think that if you went to her Twitter page, she would say, I think she's actually said, yes, the rule triggered. It may not be the signal that my research said it was in the past. So, take it from the person who's responsible for the rule to say, hey, in this case, maybe a little bit of caution is warranted here. It's triggered. remember, we had yield curves that are also, inverted yield curves are often, talked about as a sign of a recession. Well, we've had a couple of inverted yield curves happen, Andrew, in the last 10 years, where there was no recession that followed afterwards, right? It is true that typically, if we have an inverted yield curve, there'll be a recession, typically, but it's not true in all cases. And I think that's the same for the Sahm rule here. So again, if we saw an inverted yield curve, we saw the Sahm rule trigger, if we saw more geopolitical, instabilities, domestic instabilities, if we saw, investment activity start to dive, if we saw business start to decline, things like that, all of this will then tell me, yeah, we're seeing a negative pattern. I don't react on just one indicator. So what I would suggest to everyone is, to the non-economist folks that might listen to this, all five of them, hey, don't put all your eggs in one indicator in one basket. Look at everything and then look at your own personal situation.
Speaking of peaks and valleys, though, this interest rate stuff is interesting because I get those crank calls all the time where they want to buy my house or somebody wants me to trade in my car. And my first thing is like, well, yeah, look, my house has appreciated value tremendously the last few years.
Yep.
But the problem is there's no way I'm going to sell it because my interest rate is going to be probably at least double what it is right now, locked into it. A lot of people in that situation, because when times are good, I've had my house 7, that 10 to 15 year window. You get before that, you get back into the last financial crisis. But people that had those, right around 3 interest rates, like I do,
yeah,
they're not going to sell their house. That creates housing pressure. Housing is one of your specialties.
By the way, Andrew, you're absolutely right. Remember, and I want to be clear, when we talk about, these figures, we're talking about sort of averages, right, of people, right? The middle experience, but we are ignoring the fact that, yeah, hey, by the way, if you owned a house, if you're one of Americans, the 60% of Americans that own their house on a fixed rate mortgage, everybody refied during COVID. Like there's very, very, very few homes that would be in the money for refi that didn't, like vanishingly small. Like everybody paid attention. Everybody got a sub 3 interest rate, or around a 3 like that. So those folks, they, with their housing price appreciation, right, they're sitting on, a lot of equity in their house. So they're, that's a good thing for them. But then if you were renting, you had a very different experience, right? And so we talk about it being a K-shaped recovery, right? There are groups that are doing much better than others, and we need to recognize that, because just talking about the average masks that. But anyways, my digression.
But I don't know if it's an economic term, but our economy on the consumer side for homeowners, car owners, working class folks, probably, upper middle class and down. Let's just take that demographic because that's probably most of the people that are listening to this. There's a compression thing going on because people aren't selling their house. People aren't buying new cars because of the interest rate. And it goes to that rental thing you just talked about. I'll just use an example. I've got a bunch of apartments and townhouses and homes being built within about a mile of me. So same distance to stores, same distance to schools, same neighborhoods, all that stuff's the same. And the rent is so freaking high on places now. The rent is outstripping what people pay for their houses that have those rates. That's the compression. I don't know what the fancy economic term for that is, but that's what people really notice is like, well, wait a minute, these folks that have had their houses and refinanced during COVID, all of a sudden your rent's a lot more than what most people are paying for mortgages for really nice houses. People are having to pay more for rent. People are having to pay more to get a new car if they need a new car. People are having to pay more to get that starter home. That's that compression effect. And that's kind of at the core of maybe why some of this economic stuff is incongruent from your side, where it's people with numbers and letters behind their names and that stuff, and the actual people. Is that a fair way to lay it out?
Yeah, well, let's talk about what it means when you have a sub 3% interest rate. Andrew, would you ever consider moving right now? Would you sell your home and move up to anywhere else?
Yeah, but
No.
for just for the full disclosure, I would make money selling my house. I would make a very good profit. Off the top of my head, let me do some quick math here. I'd probably make about a 15 to 20% profit on what I paid for the house, even with the mortgage that remains. That's a very good return on my house. The problem is I would have double the interest rate, minimum double the interest rate, probably a little bit more than that, because I'm right at sub 3. I'd probably get about a 7 right now.
Yeah.
So I'm going to lose a quarter of that right off the top, just getting a new house, not putting in the $20,000 you're going to spend moving, blah, 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 blah. So no, I really wouldn't. No.
The answer is no, you wouldn't.
Was that a responsible way to answer that question, Mr. Economist?
Yeah,
though? Because that's thinking it out, because I've thought about it.
Unless you are having a family illness, major job change, or major family change, you're not packing up and moving right now if you're already a homeowner. And so that actually will keep housing prices fairly high, because we don't build enough housing in this country. We don't build enough housing anywhere. And you have a whole bunch of people that might want to move, but they're not going to because they are locked in. That will exacerbate sort of the feelings that you were talking about, the haves and the have-nots of the great housing price appreciation for the last 5 years. But it also affects the labor market, right? Because you have a fairly large contingent of folks who can't or don't want to move for a job, right? Because they're locationally constrained now. They would, the amount that they'd have to earn in a new job to make up for the high-priced home they have to buy at the high interest rate they'd have to take for the mortgage. It's just not going to work for that. So, that is a challenge too. And yes, well, little violin for all those folks, like you and like me, that have these sub 3% mortgages with a home that returned a good appreciation. We don't need any sympathy, honestly. But I bring that up just so folks understand that also is going to affect the labor market, because in a normal labor market, right, people would have the ability to up and move for a better job, right? And essentially what you have net right now is folks on the low end can't move because they're priced out of rents in these other areas, and maybe they're okay where they are, but they're slowly, they might be facing high rental price increases. And then folks that own the homes, they're having low housing costs right now, but they would face high housing costs if they had to move. So that's a tension that the Fed's also monitoring. That's a weakness in the economy that's not really talked about, that role of housing.
And I brought it up not because, look, I live a blessed and privileged life. Let me just say that. This isn't a complaint. I'm setting it up for this question because my children are old. My youngest is 16, almost 17. So I basically got all young adults, right? So this is all active conversation. My daughter, our oldest, just got married here, a week and a half ago. The 21, it worked out good, but they both have jobs. They're older. She's 26, he's 30. So, they're basically adults. I'm not real worried about them. My kid that's in college right now wants to get married, getting almost done with college. Her boyfriend, probably be fiance pretty soon. He's almost done with college. They're having a really hard time navigating this. Well, I have to work this, and this just to find somewhere to live. My 18-year-old's having active conversations right now, like if they're going to live anywhere near, because my 18-year-old's still at home with me, to live anywhere near where I live, their rent would be higher than the mortgage I'm paying on my house. And I'm in my mid-40s with equity and means and, liable income. They're coming right out of high school, looking to go into, trade school or college or whatever they decide to do with their partner. And they're like, how are we going to live on 2 service sector entry-level jobs? And they trying to figure out that you can't do it. And we're navigating that. There's a whole generation that's doing that right now. Cause I work with young voices, the highly college educated kids coming out with master's degrees or my kid that just wants to go to trade school after she graduates from alternate school here, because I'm very proud of her because she went back and got her high school cleaned up after some personal challenges. Those two things get treated differently in economics because they're supposed to be different social steers and economic steers. They've got the exact same problem. Master's degrees to people that just are graduating high school or not graduating high school trying to get in the service sector. They got the same problem. They can't find anywhere to live. That's going to have a ripple effect generationally through the next 5, 10, 15 years of the economics, because what's happening is, you're smarter than me, you can probably quantify this better. You're taking an entire generation of kids and you're putting them 5 to 10 to 15 years behind where our generation was when they got out of college or went into their career. Like, I didn't go to college. I went to college briefly and then went in the military. You went to college. But it set us up, and we were on that normal 20 to 30 year path that ideally an economist would say you should be on job and career wise. If you can't get housing right out of the gate, you're behind the ball, and you're going to spend most of the rest of your life catching back up, right? That's an economic indicator we need to be talking about.
There's a lively debate in Econ right now about whether Gen Z is worse off than previous generations or not. And it's a little bit murkier now, not for your family situation.
The
It's a
answer
little
is
bit
yes.
murkier. But, well, hold on. I'm going to get
Are
to
they
it.
better or worse? Yes.
Yeah, I got you on that one. Where you have folks like Scott Galloway from NYU, I believe he's NYU, talking about how Gen Z is so much worse off, and about the struggles that you said with housing and with jobs and things like that. Whereas you have other economists, I'm thinking of the Yuri from Money and Macro, who say, wait a second, not all these facts line up right. You have Raj Chetty who says, oh no, actually, I think that the Gen Z is worse off. I'm thinking this may be distinctions without a difference here, because perceptions matter. And certainly, if we think about it, right, Gen Z's making a choice that we didn't see in my generation, our generation, Andrew, because you and I are pretty much the same age, despite me looking way more youthful than you. Got to get the dig in here just a little bit.
It's just the gray in the beard. That's all.
Hey, so what I'm saying is, like, we for the Gen Z, it feels like for them that jobs don't have continue, like as we've seen, jobs don't have the same tenure, right? They're now looking at, instead of switching careers every few years or switching firms to work for every few years, which is what Gen X sort of did, and the millennials. They're looking at the gig economies and stuff like that, where there's much less sort of labor safety net, so to speak. They're looking at much higher housing costs. They're having to delay moving out of their parents' homes quite a bit because of housing costs. So they're living at home for a couple of years after graduation to sort of save up money to even be able to afford to be able to live on their own, if that can happen. Some folks look at the housing wealth and other wealth that the boomer generation has, and would say, well, when the boomer generation passes away, that will all be inherited by the younger generations that will solve the wealth gap. Spoiler alert, it will not. It's not going to work out that way. And then at the end of it also, look, I'm going to come back to it. We in this country have made a decision in our local politics. This is not a Dem issue. This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Green Party issue, or whatever the hell RFK is. This is a local politics issue where we have pretty much decided we're just not going to build housing. And if we are going to build housing, we're going to build housing that only the 1% and 2% really want to have. So we're just not giving options for folks. So that's why it's expensive. That's a conscious choice that we've made. And I can point to very liberal cities that have awful housing policies, like San Francisco, where over 92% of their land is zoned for single family only. In other words, you're not giving homeowners an option to build a duplex. And by the way, there's a lot of duplexes that are out there that if you and I drove past them, you would have no idea that was a duplex. So it's not changing the character of the neighborhood in any way, shape, or form, by adding more housing options. And then there's very, Republican leaning states that have their own housing problems as well. One of them would be like, I think of Houston. It's zoning is an absolute mess. You can see that of how now it's being affected by the storms that come in, and they can't keep their infrastructure up to speed there. And then there's the whole electrical grid thing issue. But my point being is that yes, we economists can quibble about do they really have it worse off or not. But I think on the big, most salient metrics, and housing is going to be the biggest one, followed by cars, right? That we observe, that we interact with every day, they feel worse off. And then on their career, they're looking at a lot less employer loyalty and a lot more moving around. And now, because of the advent of the internet really coming online, the ability to do things like what you and I are doing now, Google Meet, Zoom, Slack, the people that, college degree students are competing against are not just in their city. They're in their country. They're in other countries. So I think I can understand and sympathize a bit with our younger generations here.
Yeah, Stephen Popick joining us, economist. I think there's something here. You tell me, because you're in the economist circles, but at least on the commentary side, and economists are a lot like journalists. There's great investigative journalists, and then there's folks that just talk on TV that occasionally do it by accident, but they're probably not really journalists because they're TV stars now. You have some of that in economics. Let's just be honest about it. In economic circles, at least in the commentary circle, and the people that we see on TV and the people that get columns and the people that do media a lot. And I've talked to some of them at, conferences and green rooms and things like that. I don't know that some of the economist experts, and I'm not anti-experts, we need experts, but experts.
I hope you're not anti-expert, Andrew, or I'm going to stop talking to you.
Well, you're an expert in some things and not others, but we'll talk about that at some other point. We need a good expert class. I think the expert class, I get the sense is, and this dribbles over to our political class because old head economists love to get into policy and make some easy money, right? Let's just call it what it is. I've been to DC enough. I've seen that pipeline. When you get into presidential politics, Congress politics, U.S. Senate, the high level federal stuff, a lot of those older head economists that have the influence on them things, I don't get the sense that they understand that the American economy is different now than even 10 or 15 years ago. And it's definitely different than 40 years ago. We are not a manufacturing economy anymore. We are a service-based economy. And I wonder if just a little bit of that stuck in that mental rut or whatever you want to call it, I don't know that they fully understand that we are in a dynamic service-based economy now, because they don't talk like it. They still talk about manufacturing and other things. Not that they're not important, but the service sector economy that we have is a different beast than that. And it just seems like, I don't know if it's a blind spot, I don't know if it's a rut, whatever you want to call it. Some of these old head economists talking about this stuff, it's like they're talking about something that doesn't exist anymore.
I think that's fair. I mean, look, if I look at the econ journals that I read and the articles that are written in those journals, there's a pretty good attention paid to the differences in the economy and the location choices, because I pay attention to location choice literature quite a bit about why we choose where we live, about the changes in the economy, about the changes in the job market, and how it's affecting things, and how it's not like what it was. I mean, heck, I personally, I wrote my dissertation about the role that housing costs have in moving us, especially the high skill workforce, into different cities. COVID happens, and honestly, all that research that I did for 10 years is now done, cooked. Might as well throw it out in the trash, because remote work is changing that, and in 10 years it'll probably be even more. So, oh well, I have a very nice paperweight now of research that I that I could use to hold down my daughter's drawings. That's about its worth at this point. Yes, look, Andrew, the pundit class doesn't matter if you're a political pundit, sports pundit, economics pundit, TV pundit. They all get famous. They all get a following for something they've done, and you're going to play that trick as long as you can. The researcher class, that's fairly dynamic. So the way I think about it is, yeah, the talking heads that you see and all these things, probably not the best representative of whichever cast of experts they would claim to represent. The folks that are more deep in the nitty gritty, your standard professors at universities, the smart ones that are out at think tanks, et cetera, like that are doing the work, but behind the scenes, and they're not on TV, but they're writing papers, right? They're writing white papers, publishing. They're the ones that are probably seeing these things. But we're as economists, we're trying to get better at Twitter, but then Twitter sort of does its Twitter thing. And now we're trying to search for new mediums to get more information out.
You're not as bad off as the philosophers are. They're an absolute train wreck on Twitter. Stephen Popick joining us, economist. So here's the big ticket item on this. We're in election year. You can't, everybody when if the Fed does a rate cut in September, everybody's going to howl, oh, it's because of the election. No, it's not. They plan these things out ahead of time. My old line that I've heard for all my life, and I think it's truer the older I get, president gets too much blame and too much credit for the economy. I think that's an established fact. How do we parse through what we're going to hear in the political campaign, especially now that with the switch in with Vice President Harris and Trump? This isn't going to be a policy election. This is going to be a vibe election. This is going to be a generational change election. That's what this is going to be now. It's not going to be a policy heavy election. However, they're going to talk a lot about the economy because it's still the economy stupid. So two questions on this. One is there any big economic change coming between now and November, which I know you don't know, but that's your job. You got to opine on it anyway, because, hey, look, the economy doesn't go bad. I'm not sure McCain loses to Obama. And I know now in hindsight, Obama looked like a juggernaut, but that race changed when the economy swung. George W. Bush got lucky on some economic stuff, right? And then 9/11 happened and the economy went bad. And he wrote it out. The economy matters. The economy vibes in 92 got Clinton elected over George H.W. Bush. So is there anything on the horizon we should be watching in the economy? And two is, how do we turn down the noise on the promises of the presidential candidates, even though one's the sitting VP and the other one's a previous presidential candidate? So they have established records in the White House of what they do and don't do. Mm-hmm. But how do we parse that out with, oh, wait a minute, Congress has to do that, or, oh, wait a minute, that's a local function, or, oh, wait a minute, the Supreme Court's going to shut that down? How do we parse through the noise of what we're going to hear on all these pie-in-the-sky economic policies?
So I won't say what's going to happen the next few months, but except for I'll say the Fed gives a rate cut in September, right? Which they've been signaling openness to doing for a while now. It's not a surprise. Has nothing to do with any political ramifications for Trump or for Harris now. But it clearly is a boon to the Harris campaign, right? To have that rate cut, you come in, help bring things down a little bit. People see the interest rates come down right before they have to cast the ballots. It'd be a good sign. The Republican camp is going to spin this jobless report, in a negative way. The Democrats are going to spin it in a positive way. They're going to focus on the incoming rate cut. I think that we still have a very healthy overall economy. It's been running great for a number of years. Some of that is due to the policies of President Trump, and some of it's due to the policies of President Biden, but probably 80% of it is due to other things that happened outside of those two, right? I completely agree with you that presidents get way too much credit and blame. So what can we expect? Well, one, I think that even before there was a switchover in the Democrats, my political punditry is going to come in here. My understanding is that there was an expectation that the House was going to flip. If the House flips, we're stuck with divided government yet again. And we know what happens when you have divided government. Not much. You get a bunch of
Which is
continuing
not always a
resolutions.
bad thing.
You get a bunch of continuing resolutions, an omnibus bill that everybody will complain about, and a couple of post offices that are named. That is what happens. What I will say, what I think I'm picking up from both campaigns and from the party apparatus as a whole is I think we're going to wind up getting a less crypto skeptical government, I should say, in the next 4 years. I mean, Donald Trump is trying to woo crypto voters. Some of it might be genuine based on donors. Some of it might be disingenuous, trying to just get people to vote for him. So it's the same thing probably for the Democrats as well. But it seems like, where they're sort of pushing Elizabeth Warren to the side a little bit and showing more interest in doing something with this cryptocurrency space. So I think regardless of who wins, like, I think my big change is going to be that you're going to see a CFTC and an SEC that's going to be a bit more friendly to crypto. I don't know how that all plays out, for the whole economy. I think it's still a bit player, so to speak, in the economy. But that would signify a pretty sizable, shift, I think, in an emerging topic. Otherwise, we'll continue to see, the geopolitical tensions play themselves out in China and in Russia, and their ongoing conflicts that they have. Probably more of the same. I think that we'll see the Fed slowly raise the rates. I'm sorry, cut the rates. My apologies, cut that out. They'll cut the rates down, but a very slow process.
Can I be
So
cynical for just a second on this? I saw Trump at the crypto conference. He had no idea what crypto was. I listened to this. He doesn't have a clue what it
no.
was.
I mean, yeah. No,
Yeah.
he said that he wanted to have we want a cryptocurrency reserve
Yeah,
that's
he's
only based in
thinking.
the
Yeah,
U.S.
he was
Which
thinking we were going to put it in Fort Knox and keep it. Like, he doesn't even understand what the concept is. However, the people around
you
him
can
are.
technically do that in cold storage, but
Yeah.
let's put that aside.
My antenna has gone up with this sudden swing, especially from the GOP folks, because let's be honest, they picked JD Vance as their running mate. So it's the tech bro kind of wing of the party,
Yeah,
those
it's the teal
whatever
wing
term.
of the party. Yeah.
So if you want to talk about it, my antenna went up, and you tell me if this is too cynical, because I can be overly cynical, but the first thing I thought, I was like, oh, this is highly volatile stuff that doesn't actually have any fungible values. They're just setting up for the big government bailout when this all crushes them. Is that too cynical? Because that's that's the first thought I had when they're like, and then when I looked at this legislation, which is god awful bad legislation they're pushing, I'm
You're
like,
talking about the Loomis legislation?
yes, the Loomis
Yeah.
legislation. I'm like, this is 100% putting the things in. So when these guys lose their shirt, guys, gals, and whatever else, when these people lose their shirt in crypto because it was the hot new thing that's not a hot new thing, as soon as everybody decides it's not the hot new thing anymore, they want a government bailout to bulwark them up because they know this thing's volatile. That's the first thing I thought.
So what I'd say about the Loomis bill is, if we think about it for 2 seconds, like, so it wants us to have a $1 trillion Bitcoin reserve or whatever. I forget the dollar amount, but maybe it was that. So first, the United States government already owns a sizable amount of Bitcoin. You want to take a guess as to about how much the United States owns in Bitcoin? The
Well,
government itself?
it varies so much. So I would think hundreds of billions at least at a minimum.
It's about 1.4 trillion, I think. God, I
Wow.
hope
Okay.
I'm not getting that wrong. Maybe it was 14 trillion, but I think it's 1.4 trillion. If I got the decimal point wrong, apologies. I just read that earlier this week. But regardless, my point stands here that I'm going to make is we already have a $1 trillion Bitcoin reserve. The United States government already has it, and it's Bitcoins that has been seized for illicit activities. So, first, I'm just not quite understanding why we'd want to have the U.S. government assets tied up in a highly volatile speculative instrument. Secondly, why would the cryptocurrency community be thrilled with the U.S. government becoming a major player and the holder of Bitcoin. Right?
That's a red
Because
flag to me, but
then you start getting closer, and then you start setting up a government to be able to do a 51% attack. And that is where, with the cryptocurrency, if you own 51% of the network, or 50.001% of the network, you effectively control the network. Third, why does the U.S. government need to support the price of Bitcoin? Isn't it around like 70K right now? I think it's higher than it's been. It keeps seeming to hit all-time highs. It's clearly not $4,000, which it was back in 2018, 6 years ago. So it doesn't seem that there's a need for any government apparatus to prop up the price of Bitcoin. I don't think that you can. I don't know if there would be a bailout per se. Like, I don't know how you would bail out something where you can't even, where there's not a bank that has deposits for it. Like we've done that sort of a bail in the past. I don't know how you bail out a Bitcoin. But clearly they're trying to integrate it more into our government policy. But it just, there's probably better uses for $1 trillion of money, and you and I would probably have different ideas about what we could do with $1 trillion. But whatever idea either of us have, it'd be a better idea than buying Bitcoin.
Stephen Popick, let's get off Bitcoin for a minute because we get into the weeds, and let's round back off on economics where we started, practical stuff. Recession coming, recession not coming, because it's a political year. So the people that are against the current administration are going to scream that we've been in a recession. People that are in the people that are going to vote for the people already in power are going to say, no, we're not in a recession. That's how this is going to break down. Are we? Will we be? Can we be?
Magic 8 Ball says not likely.
I'm glad you brought up the inverse yield curve, and we're going to end on this because we've gotten long. I remember Twitter just going nuts over inverse yield curve. So the Sahm Rule feels like a lot like that. So you're saying if there's a couple other things that compile on it, but in and of itself, because we are somewhat in uncharted territory on an economy that we have right now. So indicators are just that. They're indicators. They're not rules.
Yeah, and unfortunately, for 2 years I had a word that I used to describe the economy on you with this podcast, and now if I say that word, people are going to think I'm saying something politically charged. So I can't call the economy what I think it is right now.
I think it's a hot mess. Is that fair enough? Can we say it's a hot mess, not just because of the numbers, but just because of the way people treat it, and it's a political year and all that. So some of it's good, some of it's bad. It's all very confusing, but that's why we have Stephen Popick come on and explain these things to us, because he knows more about it than I do. Buddy, let folks know where they can follow you, keep up with you. That was a good hour-long economics meat sandwich. Let folks know where they can keep up with you until we get you back on. Now we got you back in the rotation after a nice long break.
You can find me on whatever it's called these days, Twitter or X, at economist. I'm always happy to talk to you, Andrew. And yes, I agree with you. It's a very Chelsea Green kind of economy.
See, we almost got all the way through without too much of a wrestling reference, but our economist buddy was a wrestling referee once upon a time in another life and an agent. But we're going to, when AEW finally comes apart and we get to do the retroactive on that hot mess, we're going to have some fun with that one, buddy. Stephen Popick, good talking, sir. We'll do it again soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right.
All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.
Somos la máquina.